being here. It's an honor to have Professor Tucker from Harvard. Dicen que no se oye, pero supongo que, bueno, se me oye a mí. No muy bien. Okay, it's okay. I will try to. So then it's a pleasure to have Professor Tucker from Harvard here. Just to give just 1 minute information of how is going to be this act. Then first will speak Andrés Sendagorta, who is the Vice President of the Instituto Empresa y Humanismo, who is organizing this event. I think 5 or 10 minutes just in the presentation of the speaker. Then Professor Tucker will speak during 45 minutes approximately with the assistance of a PowerPoint. And then I will read a brief text because I know more or less what Professor Tucker is going to say. So I'm going to give a little answer, academic answer, 5 or 10 minutes too. And then we will invite the audience to give their opinion, their comments, whatever, because the spirit of the Institute is that everybody is debating these subjects. It's important to say that you can speak Spanish freely during the debate. I will try to translate the thing the best as I can to Professor Tucker. So feel free to speak Spanish if you feel that you're going to explain better your ideas. But you can obviously tell this also in English. So then I speak I pass the micro to Andres.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Buenas tardes. It's a pleasure to introduce our speaker today. We really appreciate his availability to be with us today. Aviezer Tucker has a rich triple dimension: classicist by training, philosopher of science as a scholar, a political thinker as an essayist. This gives him a depth of argumentation that makes him particularly well suited for the kind of interdisciplinary approach promoted by the Institute for Business Humanism, Instituto Empresa y Humanismo. He's a researcher at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University and has taught at the Harvard School of Government. His publications include an influential essay on the philosophy of science, focusing on the historical discipline or knowledge of the past, a philosophy of historiography, an analysis of the legacy of totalitarianism, the legacies of totalitarianism, and a profound reflection on the populist and the liberal drift of liberal democracies. Liberalism, its rise and fall, whose content is the basis of the conference we are now organizing. The attack of the Twin Towers in 2001 was a shock of gigantic proportions, since a world that had seemed very safe after the end of the Cold War was now faced with this destabilizing element, Islamic terrorism, that shattered all naive hegemonist approaches such as Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man. Over the past decade, however, a second shadow has been cast across the world, especially in the West. The unstoppable rise of populism, whose ideological foundation is in revision of democracy, not its radical questioning. In a word, modern democracy has revolted against the ideology that engendered it, liberalism. Aviezer Tucker has reflected in depth on this great paradox. According to the renewed Harvard School of Government professor, it should surprise no one that democracies can become dangerously illiberal. Indeed, this was one of the classic criticisms of the ancient democracies. Is the contemporary backlash against liberal democracy simply the same old story? Or are we witnessing something unprecedented? That is the question. The parallels between this current situation and that of the radicalism in the interwar period, which led to the terrible Second World War, are more than obvious, and invite us to reflect seriously on the repercussions of any illiberal and populist drift of democracy, with all the paradoxes associated with it. This lecture, colloquium, Aviezer Tucker sets out to argue that the contemporary revival of authoritarian populism skillfully combines some of very socially established traditions with the new technologies to produce highly unstable and contagious new synthesis that threatens basic liberal norms, from freedom of the press to the independent judiciaries. His reflections can help us examine how the economic crisis blocked social mobility and thus awakened the dark of dormant political passions exploited by new political demagogues. The slide towards neoliberal democracy can be countered if we restore a liberalism without nostalgia, instituting policies that can quench populist passions and strengthen liberal institutional barriers against them. Professor Tucker will speak for about 45 minutes on the subject. Professor Aurel of Medieval History and Director of Master of Governance and Culture of Organization at the Institute, of which he has been the director for so many years, will comment for about 10 minutes on his dissertation and will present his own ideas. Thirdly, we will give way to the colloquium, this part, which is always so important to the spirit of the conference. Finally, we will be able to enjoy a cocktail to round off the day. Professor Tucker, you've got the floor.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you for this very kind introduction. All the nice things that were said about me are true, but they are also secret. Nobody else knows it. So let's keep it among us. Right. In 2016, I had what can be called as a St. Augustine moment. My association in November of 2016, after the elections, were very much reminded me of St. Augustine hearing about the sacking of Rome. You know, Rome was not a great empire. Augustine was not a great fan, but it was the order that we knew, and whatever was coming afterwards seemed to be much worse. And I felt like it called for a philosophical or theoretical response, and that's why I came and I wrote the book Democracy Against Liberalism. And I want to discuss today two aspects from that book. One is a political analysis aspect, because I think that one of the jobs of philosophy is to try and clarify the kind of concepts that are used in the media or among people in a very loose fashion, and then they create a lot of arguments by association, a lot of unclarities, and then eventually mistakes. And then I want to raise some more philosophical or general questions. What are the lessons that we can take from this neo-illiberalism? What can we learn from it? And go back to questions about philosophy of history that were not raised, let's say, for 50 years or so, because philosophy of history tends to thrive when there are fast historical changes. The Second World War, to an extent, 1989, and now again. When things are quiet and there's just a slow historical change, people don't ask those questions. But I think that it's time to raise these questions again and examine them, knowing what we know today. So the first thing that I want to do is introduce bikini concepts. By bikini concepts, I mean the absolutely bare minimum. Because the tendency, and that's really the heritage of the Cold War, is to have a Manichaean worldview. That is, during the Cold War, you had the good, the democracy, liberal technocracy fighting the evil, authoritarianism, absolutism, and populism. And this worldview is wrong for two reasons. First, there's a continuity between those. It's not that it's either authoritarian or democracy or democratic. There are many versions in between, in the middle. And the same thing goes for absolutism and liberalism, technocracy and populism. But it's also that there are three dimensions. That is, you can have a regime that is liberal and populist and authoritarian. You can have a democracy that is absolute. And I'll get to that in a moment. So just to clarify this concept, I think would help us to understand much better the political world that we are living in. So let's see, what do I mean by a simple bikini concept, the absolute bare minimum? When we talk about democracy in newspapers, we talk about, there's a lot of all the good things, freedom, liberty, human rights, and one leads to the next. But let's just say democracy as a minimal concept, this means the accountability of the people who rule the state to the people who live in the state, accountability and representation. Authoritarianism then would be the opposite. That is the lack of accountability of the people who rule the state to the people who live in the state. And of course, between those two, there can be several levels of how democratic it is and how authoritarian it is. This is not either or, it's a matter of degree. By liberalism, I mean the limits that are put, institutional limits that are put on the state. And it doesn't matter if the state is a monarchy or an oligarchy or a democracy. The question is whether there are limits on the state itself, whether there are institutions that limit the state. Liberalism was developed not to accompany democracy. Liberalism was developed to accompany monarchy, to limit the power of kings by the rule of law, by institutions of religion. And then later, the more complex society has become, the more powerful the state is, the more limits there has to be on the power of the state. So historically recently, we introduced independent central banks. That is, central banks that limit the power of the politicians to decide on interest rates. We limit the power. We have institutions that are financed by the state but are not controlled by the state. So institutions of education, if we want to have academic freedom, the universities have to be independent of the state even when the state pays for them. The same thing goes for the mass media, the model of the BBC. BBC is paid by the British taxpayer, but it limits the power of the state. The state does not control it. These are independent. The more such institution we have, the more liberal is the state. The opposite of that is an absolutist state. That is a state that has no control by any other institutions. But that state can be democratic. It doesn't have to be a monarchy. You can also have democratic absolutism, and we'll get to that in a moment. And there is a continuity between absolutism and liberalism. Actually, most countries are somewhere in the middle. It's not in either extreme. Finally, and that may be perhaps the most difficult concept to explain, is the contrast between populism and technocracy, at least in my terminology. By populism, I mean the rule of passions. Passions are self-destructive. So the classical example is somebody comes back home and finds out in flagrante their spouse. The passion is to go to the kitchen and take the knife and finish it. But that's self-destructive, right? The interest is to say, oh, hi, and while they're getting dressed, close the bank account, call the lawyer, move all the property on your name, and make sure that that's all done. And then the conscience or the reason would be, what happened? Maybe it's my fault. Let's see how we can work this out, right? Now, populism is a policy of passions, and in my definition, and that's not a common definition, you will find other definition of populism. It's about self-destruction. It's passions that lead to self-destruction, and it can be, and the state can tolerate a moderate level of self-destruction, because states they do a lot of stupid things out of passion. They start city wars. They build huge buildings that they don't have to. They do a lot of silly things. As long as it's not too much, a certain degree of populism can be accommodated by the city, by the state, without leading to self-destruction. But populism, pure populism, is self-destruction. Technocracy is the opposite. It's the total lack of satisfaction of our passions. It's always mediating. It's something is a rational mode of achieving something else. It is practically impossible to have a modern state without some degree of technocracy. So pure populism in the modern world is probably impossible. A little bit of populism is sustainable, but for the state to survive, they need the technocrats, the modern state. So now let's see how can we combine these ideal forms. Populist liberal democracy. I think the Greek ambassador is here. I hope let's not embarrass each other. Populist liberal democracy is the economic policies of the Syriza government in Greece would have been destructive, but it was not absolutely populism. They were limited by the institutions. And therefore, there was no damage. The institutions, both the European institutions and the Greek institution, limited them. And then when it was over, it was over. They left, they said goodbye politely, and there's a new government. This is not the kind of populism that you will see in Hungary or with Trump. This was a liberal democratic populism. It can be sustainable as long, because what the liberal institutions are doing is they are preventing the populism from developing into self-destruction. There's populist rhetoric, and some of what Syriza did was not even populistic. I mean, that they wanted not to pay back the loans to Germany. That was rational. Who wants to pay back loans? They didn't get there, but it was not. That was not from a Greek perspective. That was not populistic. It was just rational. It didn't work. But so that's populist liberal democracy. Technocratic liberal democracy. That's what we had in the West after the Second World War. It was France and the United Kingdom and the United States. You have the institutions. There's democracy, and there's a class of technocrats that manage the state. And that's the model that is now being challenged. Populist authoritarian absolutism, that's the revolution. That's the Jacobin, the Jacobin revolution in France. That is, it's populist, it's self-destructive. That's 1793, the terror, it destroyed itself. It's authoritarian because it's not accountable to the people. And it's absolutist because there's no institution to limit the craziness, as it were. So populism, populist authoritarian absolutism is self-destructive. It's only a question of time until it destroys itself. And that's all the great revolutions, the destructive revolutions belong to that kind of bracket. What happens once the populism destroys itself, what is left is technocratic authoritarian absolutism. That is what you can associate, let's say, with Napoleon. He created the bureaucracy. There was no random terror anymore. He did other crazy things, starting a war with Russia. But in principle, technocratic authoritarian absolutism is a more stable regime because they are not governed by the populist passions. They have technocrats who try to keep things working. Technocratic liberal authoritarianism, that's the Singaporean system. That is, you have the state is run by technocrats. There's strong institutions. There's rule of law in Singapore. That's why it makes a good place to invest. There's good business environment, but it's authoritarian. It's not accountable to the Singaporean people. It's a technocratic liberal authoritarianism. People don't notice that, but because this combination of liberalism and authoritarianism, it seems to be in contradiction, but it's not. You can definitely have liberal authoritarianism as long as the institutions are strong and the authoritarian leaders are intelligent enough to understand that they should succumb to the institution, that it's good for them to have their power limited by the institutions. Populist liberal authoritarianism, that's quite an interesting combination. There are two such scenarios. One is especially when you had that's Kaiser Wilhelm there in Germany. There's a strong liberal middle class. The monarchy goes against the middle class and its liberal values, but it tries to ally itself with the populist lower classes, and the result, at least in this case, was war. On the other hand, when you have authoritarian regimes like in Austro-Hungary and liberal institutions, they can afford populist politics because the authoritarianism plus liberal institutions mean that the populists have no power. So you had at the turn of the century in Vienna, this is was the mayor of Vienna, a populist demagogue named Lugar, who had no power. He was saying a lot of very stupid things, and he could say all these stupid things because he knew that there was no scenario that he could actually act on it. So it made him popular with the popular fashions, but he was not. He didn't have the power to actually enact it. The Franz Joseph, the Kaiser was able, the emperor was able to limit him. Plus, the liberal institution. Austro-Hungary had strong liberal institution. So this is the multi-dimensional world. Two final regimes: technocratic absolute or illiberal democracy. This is the regime that emerged in post-communist countries after the collapse of communism. Why it was absolutist? Because they had no institutions. All the institutions they had to create from scratch. There was no tradition of rule of law, no tradition of independent institution, and that takes a very long time to achieve. They had democracy. Immediate democracy is very easy. You just start, let people vote. Creating liberal institutions, it's very difficult and takes a very long time. They didn't have that, and since they had the challenges were mostly economic, the governments they were governed by economic technocrats, and this is former Czech President and Prime Minister Václav Klaus. With that stage was indeed a technocratic, democratic absolute. Now he has become more of a populist, but he's out of power, so it really doesn't matter. And finally, we have what we want to understand. Our topic today, which is populist absolutist democracy or illiberal democracy. And my argument is that we can talk about three examples for this kind of populist that is self-destructive, absolutist democracy. It's a democracy, but it's not limited by liberal institutions. One example is ancient classical Athens. This was absolute democracy. The voice of the demos was entirely unlimited. There were no institution that would block the decision of the demos. So sometimes they made good decisions, and other times they made bad decisions. Killing the son of Pericles by vote, voting for the wrong generals, voting for the demagogues. These were all bad decisions which were not limited by institutions because there were no liberal institutions in the ancient world, not just in Athens, but anywhere. The second example is post-communist Europe. That's Orban from Hungary, it's Fico, they're from Slovakia. In the middle is the former Czech Prime Minister, but he's gone. The Czech Republic has again a liberal democracy without populism, they're technocrats again. And of course, our own Trump, who's very different path dependency. So these are three examples. What I want to ask is to try and understand what's the difference between them. What's the difference between ancient illiberal democracy or absolute democracy and modern illiberal democracy? And as I said, we have two types. We have the post-communists, and then we have the post-liberal democracy. So the obvious difference is that the kind of struggle, the kind of noise, as it were, that Trump was creating, that Orban has been creating, was absent in the ancient world. And that's because they were not limited. The demos was not constrained by existing liberal institutions. They didn't have to fight those institutions because these institutions did not exist. When the starting point is liberal democracy, an illiberal populist leader has to fight the institutions. And that's what creates all the drama. Constantly fight the judges, fight the central bank. That's what creates the drama of modern illiberal democracy. Secondly, there was no technocracy. because the ancient Athenians were voting on everything. All the jobs were voted on, or were given by lottery. But there were no established technocrats in ancient Athens. So again, the Athenian demos did not have to fight against the technocrats because there weren't any. Whereas the modern populists, they have to fight against the technocrats. And at the same time, they can't live without them, because it's in a modern society, there has to be some technocrats. But that's again, that creates the other type of constant struggle against the bureaucracy or against the state, the secret state or the powerful state. Now, ancient populist absolute democracies were self-destructive because the passions eventually, by definition, lead to self-destruction. Now, in the modern world, I would say it creates instability because what you have is a situation which we had in the United States, which we still have in Hungary and so on, of the liberal institutions. There are technocracies, and then there's the populist illiberal leader, and they are in constant struggle. And the borders between the institutions and the state are constantly shifting. They're totally unstable, and it cannot. It's not a sustainable type of government. It's highly unstable. The result is either there's a restoration, which is what we have in the United States, that the institutions and the technocracy win, as it were, because there's a democratic change, or there is a total slide towards autocracy, towards autocratic government, which is what we see in Hungary. The difference, I would say, is mostly about how strong the institutions are, because at the point of transition, the American institutions, after 200 years, were much stronger than the institutions that Hungary could have after 20 years. They had 20 years of technocratic, still a liberal democracy, but they were trying to build up the democratic institution over 20 years, not terribly successfully. That's why it's so much easier for Orban to move towards authoritarianism, and now it's very close already to the authoritarian side. So now what's the philosophy here? And why, let's put it this way. If history is a genre of movie, the association of what we see here is with a horror movie. Why with a horror movie? Because in a horror movie, what makes the horror is there's the hero and there's, let's say, the monster. And the hero kills the monster. And then you relax and you think, okay, it's over. But then the monster is always back. It always comes back. That's what makes the horror, because then you're surprised, you think it's over. And there is this sense of nausea. I mean, we tried all that before. And why is this happening to us again? Is history that we are like this mice, and we keep making the same mistakes every 2 generations? We are back again, and we tried that and we failed, and we try it again and we fail again, and we're not moving anywhere. And that's already a problem of my. That's a technical problem. Oh, okay. This raises a number of, I would say, philosophical questions that were discussed, I would say, for the last time in the 50s or 60s because of the Cold War and the confrontation with the alternative answers to this question that Marxists offered. It was the question of, is history inevitable? Or can people try and change history? Is history cyclical? Does it just repeat itself like with this mice in a circle? Or is it regressive, or is it progressive? Does the role of the individual, can individual change history? What is the role of the leader in history? Does history repeat itself? And finally, and most importantly, can we really learn anything from history? So what I did is I summarized what are the possible answers, and I got this table. And these are on the left, there are the questions, and on the top, there are the kind of answer that we have. So I divided it to totalitarian answers, which I would associate with Marxism, Leninism, and with the Nazis, liberal answers, progressive answers, and populist answers. Sometimes the populists actually don't have an answer. If the question of historical inevitability, I mean, is history inevitable? So obviously the totalitarians believe it's inevitable. There's nothing that you can do about it. There's either this constant struggle between social classes or constant struggle between the races, whatever happens is inevitable. The individual is entirely powerless. Liberalism argues that history is contingent. That is, if you do this, this will happen. If you do something else will happen. And it's conditional, and people are in a position to try and affect the future history, as it were. The progressivists agree with the totalitarian that it's inevitable, only that their arc of progress, their end would be more some sort of a liberal or political order rather than the domination of a race or the domination of a class. But there's this famous quotation of Barack Obama. There's this arc of freedom and justice, the belief that, yeah, I mean, it will end up good. It may take all kind of strange roads, but it's inevitable. There's a telos there. There's a teleology, progressive teleology, and then it is independent of the decisions of people. Populists have no idea what we're talking about. It's too many words for them. The direction of history, the totalitarians believe it will end up in a utopia, classless society or single race society. That's a utopian, and it's cyclical at the same time, because according to Karl Marx, as the means of production change, you would have different owners, different workers with the means of production. That's a cyclical. There's always a struggle between those classes, but then it will end up with this kind of utopia. For the Nazis, history was the struggle between races, and each generation or each stage there's another cycle, and then it will end up somehow with the domination of a single race. And as Hitler said at the end in his will, well, you know, we lost. The liberals think it's conditionally progressive. The history tends to go and get better, but it really depends on the decisions of people. For the progressive, it's not conditional. History has the arc of justice leads towards a more just society. And the populists, unlike other people, believe that history is regressive. That is, let's make America great again, or whatever is great again. Things used to be better, and now they're getting worse and worse all the time. It's a regressive scheme. What is the role of the individual in history? Totalitarians it is about impersonal forces, races, classes, and so on. But they believe that individuals, the great leader, the Stalin and Gottwald or Hitler, they embodies those impersonal forces. They're really not individuals. They're more like symbols of impersonal forces. Liberalism obviously is individualistic. Progressivism is again impersonal, because it believes that there are social movements that makes things much better, and then it's not dependent on any particular individual. Populism resembles totalitarianism, but without it misses the element of, or let's put it this way, that the leader is more important than the impersonal forces, because the leader is the impersonal force. So, trust me, Trump will tell you, I embody, I know, I am the United States. It's not l'État c'est moi, it is la nation c'est moi. It is an embodiment. Is history repetitive? Well, obviously the totalitarians believe it's because it's cyclical, it must be repetitive. Liberalism say, well, sometimes it repeats itself and sometimes it's not. That's what I've been arguing here. The progressivists argue it's not repetitive because it is progressive. It's just one stage after another. It's non-repetitive, and for the populists also it's not repetitive. But for them it's because as Trump said, I don't care about history. I don't study history. So if he doesn't study history, there's nothing to repeat. You don't know what happened anyway. So you cannot repeat it. Finally, are there historical lessons, and can we learn from history? The totalitarians would argue that no, there's nothing to learn from history. You can try and shorten the birth pangs, but the situation is such that anyway you're bound to do whatever the impersonal historical forces force you to do, so that you don't need to learn from it anything. Liberalism, we try to learn from our mistakes and remind people of the mistakes that we made and not repeat them. I mean, that was the whole concept of the liberal order after the Second World War, was let's not repeat all those mistakes of the 30s and 40s. What can we do to learn from these mistakes? So if it happened again, this will not happen. And you can see it very clearly in the speech that Churchill gave after the United States joined the Second World War in Washington. And he said, well, if we had, he didn't say NATO, of course, but if we had an alliance, if we had something like what would become NATO, we could have stopped the Germans in 1936 when before it developed into all the mess that it developed. And the lesson from that was create NATO. The lesson from the Great Depression was, well, we need social security. We need some sort of social network so people will not become so desperate that they will be easy prey for the populists. That's what liberalism is about. The progressivists, because they believe that every stage is new, so the only lessons that they can learn are tactical. Some things, some tactics you can repeat, like human rights tactics, social tactics, movements, but it's going to be a new situation. It's not, and that means that if you tried something in the past and it failed, you can try it again, because it's going to be a new context. The lessons are very limited, and obviously the populists don't learn from history, so there's nothing to study. This is the one thing that everybody knows about George Santayana, who's actually Spanish, even though he spent most of his academic career at Harvard, and then he moved to Italy, to Rome. Now, that's the only thing that people know about him today, partly because he was not a very good writer. It was painful for me to, it's 900 pages, and he tries to write like Nietzsche, but he doesn't have the talent, really. Because Nietzsche is short and epigrammatic and catchy. And with Santayana, he has that. He has the epigrams, and it is catchy, but you get like one good line in every 20 pages, and then it goes on and on. At any rate, his idea is actually quite Aristotelian and very simple. Aristotle said, what is virtue? Virtue is the via media. If you are brave, means is somewhere in between reckless and being a coward. If you are too much of a coward, then of course you run away and you can't lead a life. If you are too brave, then you are reckless, then you just take crazy chances. So the virtue of being brave is somewhere in the middle. And what Santayana actually says is something very similar about knowing history. And I think it actually makes a lot of sense. He says, if you don't learn from history, you end up in a situation of permanent childhood. You're always like a child that has no experience, and then they have to, burn their fingers each time again when you go to the kitchen, because you don't have the experience that you burned it already once and you shouldn't go there again. It's a permanent childhood. On the other hand, if you only live in the past, then you live in a constant trauma. That's what I like to call the reduction to Adolf. That there are many tyrants and many unpleasant people in the world. Not everybody is Adolf Hitler, and not every unpleasant tin pot dictator needs to be invaded. Yes, Hitler. There has to. Would have been much better to start a war with Hitler in 1936 and end it up much earlier with fewer casualties and so on. But that was fairly rare. Not everybody unpleasant. You have to really not know history to tell about everybody, oh, it's Hitler. And if we don't fight with them immediately, it's Munich all over again. That's living in a trauma, according to Santayana. And the via media is, history, but you understand the subtleties of history. You understand what is repeated, what is repetitive, what you can do differently, conditionally, learn from the mistakes, not repeat those. Keep NATO united, because the alternative would be an invitation to future dictator to get involved with us and learn from the mistake. And for this reason, you know, we should study history. Now, if we study history to try and answer, if you remember the list of questions from philosophy of history that I raised earlier, a good distinction is between contingency and necessity. That is, did it have to happen, or could it have been something entirely different? The answers that we give to his contingency and necessity depend very much also on how we describe events. To take I'll give you a simple example. Was it necessary or contingent that I married my wife? Well, that I married this particular wife, it was contingent, because if I didn't go to a certain lecture in Prague in 1993, and she didn't sit opposite me, and the lecture would not have been so boring, and I didn't look at her, probably we would not encounter each other. But what would have happened otherwise? I mean, would I have been single? Probably not. I would have met somebody else. Would it have been somebody entirely different? No, I would have married another intellectual. So the marrying the wife that I have is indeed contingent, but if you look at it from the perspective of social history, it's necessary actually. And why? Because there were several alternative routes that would have led to the same result, or as philosophers say, it would have been overdetermination. Overdetermination means that there are several causes that lead exactly to the same effect. And if one of them doesn't happen, the other one will. So if you look, for example, at the Industrial Revolution, Industrial Revolution was necessary because it was made of many, many different inventions. And there's plenty of historical evidence that there were different people who were working on the same projects, on the steam engine and the textile and so on. So if one of them didn't do it, somebody else would have done it, and within a fairly short time. For this reason, necessary. Was the Holocaust necessary? Probably not, because it was contingent. Really, the only Nazi with obsession with the Jews was Hitler. If Hitler was not there to push it, as the famous epigram, no Hitler, no Holocaust. Would not have been a lot of fun, but there would not have been a Holocaust. That was entirely contingent on this craziness of one person. So in other words, it depends on the sensitivity to initial conditions. If the initial conditions are a bit different, how different would be the result? You know, if Hitler died in the First World War, which is not you don't need to change history a lot to get him to die there, no Holocaust. But if one of the inventors of the steam engine would have died young, somebody else would have invented it. No sensitivity to initial conditions. On the one extreme, there's chaos. Chaos is the total absolute dependency on the initial condition. Classical example would be that the butterfly in the Amazon flips its wings, and then there's a tornado in Texas, because it's totally nonlinear. Now, history is not chaotic, even though some people use the word, but they don't know what chaos means. Chaos would be the same way, as surprising as it is, if I tell you, oh, there was a butterfly in the Amazon flapped its wings, and then 2 weeks later, there was, because of that, a tornado in Texas. History would have been like that. Means totally surprising. You wouldn't, you know, a Spanish winemaker would have poured a glass of wine, and 2 weeks later, Texas would have voted a socialist president. You know, something totally unpredictable, bizarre. We don't live in this world. We are not living in a chaotic world. What we do have is certain critical nonlinear points in history. And in the grand sense, if you say if there was one critical point, one Hitler, for example, then the rest of history obviously is nonlinear, because there was one nonlinear point. But what I would argue is actually, if we try to do this analysis of causation in history, and that's what historians can do, what we have is long periods of nonlinearity interspersed by few points long periods of linearity interspersed by certain points of non-linearity. Take a simple example. Wars are totally linear. Why? Usually they are linear because you have balance of forces. Big causes have big effects, totally linear. Now, what about our current situation? Are we stuck in this kind of mill like the mice, and are we lost in this kind of historical inevitability, historical necessity, because is illiberal democracy overdetermined? Is it necessary? Well, here's something that I think we can pretty simply see. What were the contingencies? To what extent was it non-linear? And then, if we are good liberals, we're trying to learn from our experiences and learn the lessons. So the Brexit plebiscite, which by itself actually it's not, it's the Britain is not an illiberal democracy. It's still a liberal democracy with some populistic elements in it. That was totally non-linear. It was a decision. It was a gamble, basically, that Prime Minister Cameron took. He was not forced to do that. He didn't have to do it. This was entirely non-linear. And if he learned anything from history, he would not have done it, because plebiscites never end well. That's the whole history of the world. They're easily manipulable. It's a populist vehicle for channeling the passions. And what he did is he did not learn from history. So one simple lesson from history: stop it with this nonsense with plebiscites. Politicians get money to make decisions and to become experts, so they should work for a living, and not pass the decision to people who are not necessarily ready for that. The internet, especially Twitter. I don't know if you're familiar with Twitter, but Twitter gives you basically 3 sentences. Now, when it's 3 sentences, it means you can express your emotions, you can express your passions, but you can't give reason, because there's no space to give reason. You can't say because that's you're already running beyond. You can't. There's no space for reasoning. There's no space for arguing. It's just expressions of emotions, and that replaces what was the worst of the ancient marketplace, of the ancient agora. The place where people in the night would get their passion all worked out, and that is a contingency on this technological innovation, but even more so on the lack of regulation. Because with every new technology, the radio, which was a very important political tool for people like Hitler, television, which is still an extremely important political vehicle in Russia, people learned what was wrong with it, and then they learned the lesson and regulated it, so they can keep the technology but keep it away from being self-destructive. And here we were too slow to try and regulate that, and we're still struggling about that. But I think if it was properly regulated, it did not have to end the way that it ended, to be used, to be manipulated so easily. I worked in the 90s. I worked in the Czech Republic, or what was then Czechoslovakia, then became the Czech Republic. And I had in my office a radio from the communist era. The radio had a single button for volume. And very simple way of regulating it. You don't want to have radios with a single button. That's a totalitarian vehicle. Majority electoral systems favored extremist minorities, because what we see is that, with the exception of Orban in Hungary, the illiberal populists never got the majority anywhere. Only in Hungary they did. And the reason why they were able to have the kind of overrepresentation was because of the electoral system. And that's something that can be fixed. You contrast that with what happened in France, for example, 2 rounds, and then with each round goes to the next round, the 2 top, and then the more centrist candidate usually has the advantage, which is what happened to Macron. when you have 2 rounds. The situation is similar to if you go to one of those ice cream parlors where they have 70 tastes. So if we are all allowed to buy whatever ice cream we want, there will be some weird, garlic ice cream and so on. But if we are all forced to agree on one ice cream for all of us, we'll probably settle on something like vanilla. Not the most exciting, but good enough. Even better would be to have ranked voting, which we have in some parts of the United States, in some countries. That is, when you vote, this is my favorite candidate, this is my second favorite candidate, my third favorite candidate. And then in the first round, if your first candidate doesn't get enough, goes to the second, your vote goes to the second and the third and so on. And the tendency of people who are ideological and young and excited is that the first choice could be the extremist, but then they will end up with a vanilla. And if in this kind of electoral system, with the possible exception of Hungary, actually could have prevented this whole populist wave, because they would not have had the majority. They would have a substantial minority, but not a majority. Obviously, I don't need to teach you about EU subsidies. Unconditionality was not a good idea, because unconditional subsidies ended up giving Orban the power to distribute patronage. Because what keeps Putin is not an illiberal democrat, he's just a totalitarian leader, but what keeps Putin in power is the money that he gets from the energy sector mostly, and nickel and natural resources. Hungary doesn't have any of that. What keeps the Hungarian regime in power are EU subsidies. So the EU ends up paying for its own self-destruction, which is not very wise. And the solution would be to conditionalize. Finally, there's a huge problem, at least in the United States, with social mobility. That is, for all its other minuses, Reagan produced a lot of social mobility. There was a lot of movement, and the people who became successful under Reagan then created a lot of institutions to keep themselves where they are and block mobility. So they cannot fall down, but then it also means that other people cannot go up. And they create a lot of mechanisms, things like regulating housing. Why there are so many unemployed, unhappy people in the middle of America? Well, partly because it's very expensive to move to the coasts where there are jobs. Why is it more expensive? Because housing is very expensive. Housing is very expensive because the regulations prevent people from building high and building new. The people who are there are happy with what they have, and it keeps the value of their houses high, but it blocks mobility. It blocks movement. Another obvious thing is to facilitate geographical mobility also, not just of people who work, but also people who don't work. That is, people in the United States, in places like where I live, near Boston, in California, they're expensive places. So when they become pensioners and they have a fixed income, they move somewhere cheaper, like Florida. There's always this movement to Florida. But what do the people from Florida do? Well, they can look for something cheaper, let's say in Alabama. But where would the people from Alabama go? Well, why don't they globalize? Why, if people from Mexico come to work in the United States, why shouldn't American pensioners go down and live in Mexico? It's cheaper than Alabama and they have nice beaches. Well, because they can't get health insurance there. Because the healthcare system, after age 65, the American state is paying for people's health insurance, but only in the United States. So they can't get health insurance, and Mexico has a problem with security. So they're afraid of crime. Well, in the same way that American Express can service me anywhere, why not health? You just expand it and you can hire local doctors or bring American doctors, make it easier for them to move, and see that globalization actually can work for pensioners as well. And the same thing actually would work with sovereignty. That is, people would say, why wouldn't American police be in the areas of Mexico where American pensioners would be? Well, that would be violating their sovereignty, right? American imperialism. Well, there's a lot of this going on in the world just as a pragmatic issue. People in Spain are usually football fans. Well, the English, we have a problem with the football fans. So what happens is that the English very often send English policemen to be with their fans. Now, literally speaking, this is a violation of sovereignty. But it's simply, but if you don't look at it from the perspective of sovereignty, you just say, here's a pragmatic problem. What's the best solution? Probably it's better for the for law and order for British policemen to deal with British hooligans. They know better how to deal with them. The same thing would happen. Czechs, the most popular tourist destination for Czechs is Croatia in the former Yugoslavia, because they have beaches. The Czechs don't have beaches. They speak a similar dialect, similar Slavic dialect. And in the summer, the areas where Czech tourists are based or go usually often to are patrolled by Czech police. Why not? The basic idea is that if we remove some of those barriers to social mobility, to geographical mobility, liberalism can still work. That's where I come. I mean, the slogan that I invented, liberalism without nostalgia, I stole it from the conservatives, really, because neoconservatism in the United States was defined as conservatism without nostalgia. And I think the liberals have the same problem. They're just too nostalgic to the way things used to be. And instead of that, we should learn from the historical mistakes that were made and take this as a learning opportunity to improve the kind of policy that we have. We learned a lot from the crisis of the 30s and the 40s. And indeed, I mean, if we look at the economic recession of 2008, no soup kitchens, no Hooverville, that is shacks that people were living. I mean, a lot of the unpleasant things of the Great Recession did not repeat themselves because of Social Security, because of the reforms that people did later and worked. And of course, NATO protected the peace. And Madeleine Albright died recently, but she lived to see exactly the idea of expanding NATO in the 90s worked like magic, basically. Because obviously, I mean, if there was no NATO in Europe, then Putin would have moved to Riga and to Tallinn. It's just walking across the border, no natural barriers, no strategic depth. Just go there, send the Spetsnaz, and that would have been it for the Baltic states. He didn't do that because it's NATO. Had Ukraine been NATO, he would not have been able to invade Ukraine. I mean, the reasoning that Winston Churchill had back in 1941 works just as well now. And Madeleine Albright did that, and she expanded NATO, and I think we should be thankful for her. So what we need to ask ourselves now is not to be nostalgic for the achievements of the past, but say what didn't work. So obviously the liberal social security measures from the 30s, 40s, 50s, they worked in preventing the kind of terrible poverty that created all the political extremism in the 30s. They limited unemployment. The people were not so desperate. But obviously, it missed something. It missed the kind of existential insecurity that people had. Because what we have a tendency as human beings is to interpret our historical experience, especially when we don't know history, in Stone Age terms, and is to think about every economic crisis. Oh, this is an existential crisis. We will die. The tribe is in danger. We need to kill the weak within the tribe and attack the neighbors and get some crazy leader to help us do all that and steal the cows from the other tribe and take away their water. And it's a misinterpretation, but the problem is there. And the kind of measures that liberals would have to do today to think about is how to preempt that before it is happening. Now, all these things that I suggested above, all these small measures, they would have preempted populism, because the populists would have at most been a substantial minority. But I would love better to just preempt it to begin with, to give people the kind of security and self-respect so they don't go for that, so they don't feel like they are in kind of this kind of existential crisis. And one such idea that people suggest is the possibility of universal basic income, that every human being knows that this is the minimum salary that they will always have, irrespective of what happens to them, whether they work or don't work. So they have this kind of basis to, and that should create perhaps a different culture, because if everybody knows that they can have a minimum, then they would not be afraid, and they would direct their interests to doing other things, read books, make poetry, work with wood. So if you don't work, you still have this minimum. You do other things. You don't feel like your very identity is threatened, and that would be something of a different culture. The danger, of course, it would unleash inflation. Taxes would be too high, but at least this would, if it's a mistake, and I'm not saying it's not, it would not be a mistake. It would at least be a new mistake, without nostalgia. We should try something. We should be innovative, not just dream. Oh, the great, or the 50s, the 60s, or the 30 years in Europe, the 45 to 73. These were the great days, and we should go back there. We can't, even if we wanted to. We can't go back there, and they were not so great, actually. If you really think about it, they were not so great. They appear so great because they came after the Second World War. In comparison to the Second World War, they were great. But by themselves, I think we can do better. And that's the idea of liberalism without nostalgia. And I think I'll stop here. Let something. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tucker. We appreciate very much your work. It was a very interesting talk. Then I'm going to speak. I'm going to read a brief writing that I've made with the ideas of, this is the book that gave place to this conference. So we have just listened to a dissertation in the Purists DNA Instituto Empresa y Humanismo style. Aviezer Tucker took us into the world of the major trends in current political ideas. He did so from a historicist perspective, with the weight of experience, but also from a multidisciplinary perspective, because there is no other way to make an interpretative judgment of the current situation without falling into simplifications or reductionism. The intellectuals who are contributing most to the current intellectual and political debates have constructed historical genealogies or historical ideological genealogies. I am thinking on thinkers like Thomas Piketty, the neo-socialism arguing, then Tony Judd, the social democracy spirit, or Harari, which I don't still what he's trying to say exactly, but the kind of materialism, integral materialism. So all of them are constructing these genealogies, using the past for presenting their ideas. So the key question here is if we are using the past to legitimate the present and to invent whatever we want. That's why Trump said that history no matters, because he may do what he wants to do. Or we go to history in the spirit that Professor Tucker has disserted this evening, trying to learn the lessons of the past, but not using the past in the sense of manipulate it. These thinkers turn to history to escape from perhaps attractive, but certainly fanciful answers. Contemporary utopias have proved to be fallacies which, far from solving the complex problems facing today's societies, have increased them. We have already had the terrible experience of communism, which devastated the society and economy of so many countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America during the 20th century. Today, new forms of neo-communism are appearing everywhere, usually in the form of populism. We do not seem to be learning lessons from the past. Alongside neo-communisms, Professor Tucker referred to neo-liberalisms. Someone said that crises are the result of the perception of something that is dying, and what should replace it has not yet been born. The feeling that a world is crumbling and yet no alternative is in sight is well reflected in the figure of Saint Augustine. Just as the great intellectual of Hippo saw the Roman Christian world he had admired crumbling, but could not find an alternative, today democracy and liberalism have entered into a deep crisis. But there seem to be no alternatives other than the negative responses of authoritarianism and absolutism. The paradox is that democratically elected leaders question and demolish the very rules that brought them to power. The technocratic regimes of the post-war period, whose heyday is to be found in the conservative revolution of the 1980s, have proved insufficient to provide a convincing response to the demands of the complex contradiction of capitalism. Lin Han, the historian, stressed the degradation of the idealism of the French revolutionaries, whose liberalism degenerated into Jacobin absolutism into Napoleonic dictatorship, I would say technocratic authoritative absolutism, and republicanism into communism. It seems that political and ideological movements need to create monsters to preserve themselves until the fallacy of their arguments is demonstrated. Professor Tucker has postulated the desirability of learning from the past, but he himself has been somewhat skeptical of the ability of today's political leaders to recognize lessons from history for the present. This is because politicians often turn to the past to make it usable rather than understandable. They turn to the past in search of legitimations of their present, so that its distortion, if not a gross manipulation, is inevitable. It is clear that the questions raised by Professor Tucker at the end of this speech deserve careful reflections on our part. He quoted Santayana wise words: those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Echoing that formula coined by classical historiography, which conceived history as a magistra vitae. But one has the feeling at times that today we also find ourselves moving in the completely opposite direction, the hypertrophy of memory. In reality, both collective amnesia and the hypertrophy of memory are the result of the same attitude of turning the past with the sole aim of legitimizing the policies of the present, instead of looking to the past for lessons to help set the present on the right course if necessary. Many more questions remain in the air, and we will certainly not to be able to exhaust all of them in the debate we are now starting. But in any case, we always write some fruit of these dialogues between humanistic and social disciplines, between academics and entrepreneurs, between humanism and business. So we can now start the debates. I can direct the traffic. So if someone, as I said before, you can speak freely Spanish, English, or other peninsulas languages like Catalan, or I can translate Catalan.
Czech,
too,
French.
Czech, French. We have here lots of possibility. Greek. Sure, Andres.
It's often said that defeat you cannot manage, you just take what you've got. But victory you need to manage. Now, a poor victory management in World War I eventually came up with World War II. Now, if we come to today, it's pretty obvious that that Russia is losing. It's already lost its bet, regardless if they keep Donbass or not. They lost. So my question would be, what would be the wise way of the West to manage the eventual victory that probably is going to happen.
Right. I think one historical parallel to what happens today, I would say, and that's irrespective of the military result, is what happened after 1968 to communism. The invasion, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. This was the ideological defeat of communism, because the association of, if you have a soft power, if you have an ideology that can expand and can have people believe in it, you don't need the tanks. And when the Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, it was an admission that the ideology failed. So they needed the tanks. They couldn't convince people. And it was a spectacular public failure because everybody could see that. Now, we have to admit that Putin's regime had some soft power, at least since Putin returned to be a president in 2012. This kind of syncretic, I would say, witch's brew of xenophobia, reactionary social values, opposition to homosexuality, and so on. It had some kind of power, even though it was actually entirely internally inconsistent, but ideologies very often are, because Putin was trying to present himself as a Russian Orthodox, religious Russian Orthodox, together with Lukashenko, who is Soviet-era atheist, together with American extreme Protestant evangelical Christians and some extreme Catholic conservatives. These things don't work together, not in the real world. So it was always inconsistent. But what happens now is that he is losing the ideological war. He lost all his soft power. Even if he conquered the whole of Ukraine tomorrow, that's been lost already. This kind of soft power. And you can see that in the recent French elections. I think he gave Macron about 10%. If you look, what were the French election polls before the invasion of Ukraine? And the ultimate result, Macron gained 10%, and that's because he was in debate with Le Pen, and he constantly hammered in Russia, Russia, Putin, Putin, who's paying you, where does he want? He created this association. And most of because Putin, of course, he's not ideological. It's for him, it's just a mean. He has no ideology. He was supporting all the extremes with the hope that they would fight each other. The extreme left, the extreme right, doesn't matter. And the people the politicians and the social movements on the extreme left and right, they were not very careful to dissociate themselves from him. So now it's sticky. Because the point is now what will happen is, if you think what happened to Eurocommunism in the 1970s, it did not disappear in one day, but it basically split it into three groups. There were the people who remained loyal to Moscow and kept losing popularity. There were the Eurocommunists who said, well, we are Marxists and so on, but we don't agree with the invasion of Czechoslovakia. After all, Dubček was a communist. And we can dissociate Marxism from the Leninism. And then there were the ones who moved to and said we are just social democrats. Right? So this sort of thing would be forced now on all these people who got associated with Putin. Some of them will stick with Putin, and then they will just become marginal. There will be the ones who say, well, we can be nationalistic, reactionary, xenophobic, but it doesn't have to involve Ukraine or invading other countries, and the ones who will become just normal conservatives. The problem for all these people is that the more they deny their association with Putin, the more it will stick. Because if you think about the communists in the 70s and 80s, the more they said, oh, we were once, yes, we were loyal to Moscow, but we are not loyal anymore. But the very imperative that they have to be forced to talk about it just reminds people all the time how much they were involved. It's very sticky. It will be very difficult for them to dissociate themselves. They will try, but they will fail. It will just be impossible. What the hope of the American liberals now is that Ukraine will save us. Is that here's because the soft power that was so strong in the 90s, and younger people, I lived those 90s in East Europe. I remember the soft power of wanting to be like the Germans, actually more than the Americans, because Germany was a totalitarian, the Nazis, and it was so successful. So the Czechs or the Poles say, why aren't we like the Germans or the Austrians, more than the Americans? But this soft power was lost now. And now here we have somebody who's outside of the club, Ukraine. And I mean, here's the British wanting to escape the plan. Oh, it's sort of, and here are these people, all they want is to be like us. All they want is to join Europe and NATO, like how it was in the 90s. So the hope is that and they have a nice charismatic leader, an actor, like Reagan. And actors usually they act as long as they don't need to write their own lines. They're quite good. And he, he's probably pretty good at that. And he can sort of then have this kind of soft power, telling the people, you want to escape the European Union. Look how these people they're sacrificing their life just to join the European Union. And maybe this would lead to some kind of get us out of this morass of pretty much the whole of this century so far. I mean, there were more quiet periods, there were more difficult periods, but since 2001, of course, the war in Iraq, we lost our self-confidence, we lost our certainty. And what I would argue, if you think about Fukuyama was right when he said, look, we tried communism, we tried fascism, everything failed, we are just left with liberalism. He just went one false assumption. And his false assumption was, oh, we learn from history and we remember. And we don't. Because what we have when we don't study history, the term that I like to use is we become locked in a Sisyphean cycle. That is, every 2 generations, we don't remember, we don't study history. So if we didn't experience it ourselves and we didn't hear it from our parents, we will try it again. We will again, okay, maybe extreme nationalism, world wars are not such a bad idea. Try it again, fail again. And in some countries, actually, you can see this. I mean, you look at, let's say, Argentinian history. This cycle, the populism, the failure of the economy, military joins, then the military moves back to democracy, and it's like locked in a cycle. It's like these mice that I showed there. The only way to escape the cycle is, to reach historical nirvana, if you want, to escape is to learn history, study from history. Just try, fail, but try new things. Don't just repeat the same stupid things all over again every 2 generations. And you can see it quite well now. You have a young generation doesn't remember communism anymore. So suddenly these ideas are coming back. The older generation doesn't remember fascism. So they start playing with that. And you see in some countries, like in France, the old people remember, they remember Pétain, so they vote they don't vote for Le Pen. It's the younger people who don't remember vote for Le Pen. In the United States, it's the other way around because the old people don't have any memory of fascism. We never had that. So they play with the older people. And, some of them, these would be the people who were marching against the war in Vietnam, are now playing with those games because they have no memory. Actually, I didn't answer you. Because if you see what this ends, my argument about Ukraine is, I think it's a mistake. I mean, it is a struggle between democracy and tyranny because Ukraine had democratic elections and Putin is a tyrant. But much more than that, historically, and that's why I think the Ukrainians would win even if they lost the battle, the military battle. It is a struggle between nationalism and empire, and for that you have to go back to the 19th century. The model is, like Greece against the Ottoman Empire. It's the Italians against the Austrian Empire. It's Garibaldi. It's the Poles against the Russians. It's a national, because Russia is the last multinational empire. And for this reason, for Putin to be a Russian nationalist, it's actually entirely self-destructive because there are so many people in Russia who are not Russian, who are not Orthodox. It's still the biggest country in the world. And it's the last empire, and he wants to expand the same stupid things that the empires that started the First World War. Austro-Hungary, it was not a bad country. It had a huge potential. It had liberal institutions. They needed to democratize. They needed to modernize more than they modernized. But if they didn't start the idiotic war, the First World War, they didn't have to break up. The nationalities, the Slavs, the Hungarians, many of them did not want independence. They wanted autonomy, they wanted liberalization. It didn't have to happen, but the logic of the empire is you have to expand or you collapse. And in modern history, there are always the national struggles, and the nationalists usually don't give up. If you look at the most telling example is Poland. 1795 divided between three countries: Prussia, Russia, and Austro-Hungary, or the Habsburg Empire. Now, anybody who thinks logically, look, here's this Polish nation, and with these three giants swallowing it, well, the Poles will just disappear. The Poles will become Russians and Austrians and Prussians. It didn't happen. Because in the modern world, nationalism has this kind of strength. And when you try, the more you try to suppress nationalism, actually, the stronger it becomes. German nationalism was created by Napoleon because he occupied Germany. And the German nationalists, they also didn't like the monarchies, but they didn't like Napoleonic occupation. So they had to ask themselves, why do we oppose Napoleon, even if we share some of his ideals? They said, well, we are Germans and he's French. They invented nationalism. The more you try to suppress that, the more nationalism becomes stronger. So even if Ukraine, short of genocide, even if Ukraine was defeated, so it will take them another 100 years, like the Poles. But they're doing now, the Russians did it for them now. They created now the Ukrainian nation. And that's it. The toothpaste is out of the tube. You can't put this toothpaste back. They will have a nation. And the nation will try and have a state. It may not even be a liberal state in the end. But they will. But nationalism is such that they're not going to give up. And they're not going to give up because the Russians created them. If the Russians didn't want a Ukrainian nation, what they had to do was to leave them alone, open the borders, offer them, oh, you can come and work, and have this kind of soft exchanges, soft influences, and then fluid identities could have congealed in another way. Because when nationalism starts, identities are extremely fluid. If you think, if we don't project later ideas, if you look, for example, I will not speak about Spain because then I'll make mistakes and you'll correct me. So I'm going to make other mistakes that you cannot correct. If you look at Czech nationality, there were people who were speaking Czech, people who were speaking German, there were Jews, there were three nationalities. But while this was happening in the 19th century, it was extremely fluid. And people were marrying each other, and people were choosing identities, and sometimes they were combining them. Very telling, if you look at the areas of the United States that were settled by people who came from what is today the Czech Republic, they were called Bohemians. Some of them spoke German, others spoke Czech, many spoke both, and they thought about themselves as Bohemians. And the Americans, because we are such a welcoming nation, we invent a racial epithet to every new immigrant that we get, and then they invented the name Bohang, which you probably never heard because that's how racism should really end. Just people forget it. Which was a slur against Bohemians. But they were not German, they were not Czechs. That was congealed much later. If you let this situation remain fluid by not discriminating, by not constructing a nation, right? It can go actually your way. The more you try to assimilate, the more difficult it is, and the more you're constructing the nations. That was the mistake of Putin. And for this reason, Ukrainians would win. Even, I'm not a military strategist. It looks like they are winning. But even if they lose the military battle, they will have a nation because they already have a nation. And they have a nation because Putin created that nation. Well, that was very bombastic.
I'm Petro Tsarouris. I'm the Counselor for Public Diplomacy of the Embassy of Greece. I'm very glad to see you here. I think we study in the same country. I will explain that to you afterwards. Добрый день, каждому приводит.
Dziękuję.
My question is, have you, well, during your investigation, writing this book, have you identified any particular correlation between crises in general. It might be, well, economic, it can be national crises, it can be, I mean, crises of all kinds that we have experienced over the last 20 years. Any correlation between the populist movements and the volumes of what we call middle class in our country, and those different expressions of authoritarian personalities, illiberalism, and populistic movements with radical agenda. And if you have already identified, what is your conclusion about that?
Right. It's interesting to note first that there's a contrast between populism and illiberalism. And the contrast is that populism, as I argued, is self-destructive. The illiberal leaders, the Trumps, the Orban, and so on, they're usually not, I mean, Trump, I don't know, but Orban is not an idiot. They're smart people. They know that if they act on the populism, they will be self-destructive. So they have to maintain policies that are either mildly populistic or not populistic at all, while taking over the institutions because they want to become authoritarians. And to compensate, that's why you have the inflammatory rhetoric. Because the rhetoric, you don't have to pay for the rhetoric in the way that you have to pay for policies. Rhetoric, unless people start taking their own rhetoric too seriously, which was Putin's problem, perhaps, they can go on doing the opposite of what they are saying they are doing, and then they're very good at manipulating attention, because you can't, when people are inflamed with passions, it's pointless to tell them calm down. It's not going to work. What you do is you frighten them with something else. You keep moving from one scary thing to another, and then they forget the first thing, and you move to the next. And it's a difficult game to play. Now, what they can do, how is that related to the middle classes? But it's rather, it's the fear, it's how middle class people, or even more so lower middle class people, misinterpret economic crisis. Do they feel like that their identity is, that they're not going to be themselves anymore? Are they afraid that they will fall economically and will become destitute? It's not so much the objective reality that we're looking for, but how the reality is interpreted. Because after all, in all the, as I said, I mean, the policy measures that people instituted after the Great Recession in the 1930s basically worked this time. We didn't have anything remotely as horrible as what we had then. Nobody went hungry. We have some homelessness, but it actually did not increase because of the crisis. That is, people lost homes, but they became not homeowners anymore, but they had a roof over their head. They were not living in the street anymore. We had people living in the streets before. It didn't increase. So all these things worked, but people interpreted it as if this is approaching what they had before. And that's why neoliberalism, it will not have, it can't be just materialistic. Somehow it has to work on the psychological level of making people feel secure enough with their identities, making them feel sufficiently confident that they don't they don't become so afraid that somebody who can manipulate those fears can lead them to where they want to lead, which is actually somewhere entirely different than from their interests. Because the interesting thing is, if you look at what are known as the populist leader, which are really the illiberals, none of them is from the bottom of society. These are all elites. Either these are very rich people, Berlusconi, Trump, and so on, or these are people who used to be normal politicians, conservative, center, left wing, and then they saw where the money is, and they shifted. So you have, Orban was liberal conservative prime minister, pretty normal, nothing very scary. President Zeman of the Czech Republic, he was a social democrat, pretty, kind of Tony Blair kind of social democrat. He did actually, when he was prime minister, did a very good job. in the economy. And then they move, and people knew them before. This leadership, this liberal leadership, it's not genuine popular. It's not somebody who it's not a worker, you know. It's not the Paris Commune that really was led by workers. These are people who are manipulative elite people who and they are there not because they have any conviction, but because they see they have an opportunity. It was the same thing if you know if we talk earlier about a familiarity with the Czech Republic. Zeman started out, he was kind of right-wing economist, but Václav Klaus was the right-wing, was already there. So he had to go somewhere else, and he became a social democrat. He became a social democrat, actually was very successful, but then his own political party kicked him out. And then Putin came and offered him the money to become president. He gave him through the energy companies, they gave him the loan, same way that they gave it to Le Pen. And then he discovered populism and he became a populist. This is not about conviction. Point, if you want to preempt that, and that's all, it's all about preemption. If we believe in liberal democracy, we have to look for how to make people stop feeling so afraid, how to preempt the fear. And then, as I said, one way is possibility is just say, well, you will always have a salary, you will always have a place in society. But another solution is simply to be is what we used to call spirituality. Because look, if you are a very religious person, you believe that you will, in the Judeo-Christian sense of the word, and you believe you were made imago Dei, you're in the image of God. You're still in the image of God, even if you lose your job, and you can still you still understand that you can have a spiritual life irrespective of all the crazy things that happened in the economy. And then what the libertarians saying, and in that respect, it's true. If that an economic recession is like the flu. If you don't do anything, it goes by itself, which is true. But the problem is that most people get so hysterical while this is happening that it never goes away. You know, you can imagine that you have just the flu and it will go away, but so you start taking drugs and you do crazy stuff and you do ruin your health because you can't do anything, because you're so afraid that you can't stop doing it. And another solution is to study history and to study the mistakes that people made. To just the probability is that as long as we have something like a free economy and the alternative is worse, we will go through 1 or 2 or 3 economic recession in each our lifetime. And if you teach kids in school, look, it's going to happen to you. There will be a recession. You may lose your job. This thing happened in history. And this is how we dealt with it. And this is the kind of horrible things that, you may get so angry and so afraid and you will want to strongly. It may happen to you, but this is what happens when this, when this sort of thing happens. It could preempt that by studying history, because the problem is national history. When countries teach history, it's very tempting to always teach the great achievements of our ancestors, the great the great national achievement, the great thing that we did, our victories. It's okay. But actually, it's much more useful to teach all the mistakes, not that just you made, but all the mistakes that other people made, because then you don't try not to repeat it. Because, the old saying is, you will never have enough time to make all the mistakes yourself. So learn from the mistakes of others. And what happened to us now is we really seem not to have learned a lot of mistakes from our historical mistakes. I think to a large extent because we don't know history. Now, what you would notice is that what I offer here is totally non-systematic, because what I do is I have this problem and I say, I'll throw whatever I can at it, whatever idea I have, and see what works. But that's the thing what we have to do, not be nostalgic, not say, how do we go back to 1970? Okay. Well, we're not going to go back to 1970. We were young and we were pretty, and the world was, and there was misogyny and inequality, and there was racism. And let's not forget all of that. All these things it wasn't so great. We in some respects, we are much better off than we were in those 30 glorious years. But let's see what ideas we can have now to learn from all those mistakes and at least make new mistakes. Not do the boring mistakes, make interesting mistakes.
Okay, unless someone wants to take, okay, one last
Quick question. I'm curious, where would you put the European Union on your chart?
Right. Well, the European Union has obviously a democratic deficit. It's not an authoritarian regime, but remember, this is not Manichaean. And what's the danger when you have when the regime is not sufficiently democratic? It leads to populism because there are no results to populism. What happens? You see, if my vote doesn't count and I espouse something crazy, but it doesn't affect policy, there are no limits. I don't have to be afraid what would happen if what I ask for actually happens, because it will not happen. That's what causes all the extremism, let's say, in the in semi-authoritarian regimes like the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Why? Because the power was in the hands of the emperor, of the Habsburg emperor. Now people could vote. There was they vote. There was a parliament, but the parliament didn't have power. So they could have whatever crazy ideas they came up into their heads, because anyway, they knew that there are no effects. So you can just satisfy your voters and nothing bad would happen anyway. So in that respect, if the European Union is not sufficiently democratic, it encourages populism. And it would be an interesting experiment to see now what happens in the UK. To what extent they will catch themselves and say, what did we do? Because they believed in their own rhetoric, but nobody thought that they will vote for Brexit. Even the people who espoused Brexit didn't believe it would happen. And that's why they were able to be so extremist. Now we'll see how much they like it and for how long. Because then it's maturity. Suddenly you have to take responsibility. So European Union, obviously it needs to be more democratic. I think it would have a good effect. It would make it less populistic. Also, ranked voting would be a very good idea to limit the extremes. So we will have more vanilla politicians, more boring people in power. But of course, what we don't want is to give up on the free movement of people, ideas, and trade, because that's what keeps everything, that creates this prosperity, and just not do stupid things. I mean, because before the European Union, what political unit gave the maximum mobility was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And just think, what they did for Vienna and this flourishing. And then they had to go and do, they created prosperity and huge mobility. And then they had to go and do something very stupid and start totally unnecessary war. For that reason, we need to keep the prosperity going. And then hopefully, finally, there will be the soft power that young people, again, they don't remember if you visit East Berlin, West Berlin before the unification. Black and white movie, misery, and then this colorful West Berlin. That was soft power. If European Union can project this soft power, which it definitely has now in relation to Ukraine, then we can have this new liberalism that I so much would crave to have. Now, what can Malta teach us? That's why I love Malta. The Knights of Malta, it is a state with embassies, but no territory. It is disconnected, not the country of Malta, the Knights of Malta. It demonstrates the possibility that you can have a non-territorial state. And the idea there is, it's actually somebody that I discovered, and then I translated it from French. It's a Belgian thinker. Actually, he's mostly known today as a botanist. His name was Émile Depuit. In 1860, he published an article called Panarchy. And his idea was, the problems of Belgium in 1860 were actually very similar to the problem today. Relatively reasonable people, not violent people, but you had the Flames and the Walloons, you have the conservative monarchists, the liberals, the Catholics, the Protestants. His question was, how can we all live together? And his idea was deterritorialize it. What would happen is you go to an office and you declare this is going to be my state. You register with that state, and then you subject yourself to the laws of that state. And the person who lives next to you can go on with a different state, and you sign a contract, an explicit social contract, constitution, for a period of time. And then if you don't like that state, you change it later. It creates a lot of exit, and then a lot of people can live together under different constitutions. And then people say, well, what about Westphalia, the Westphalian order? Otherwise, you had the religious wars and so on. Well, when we have different insurance policies with different insurance companies, we don't necessarily go into war. So if I have one insurance policy and my neighbor who lives below me in an apartment building is a different insurance policy, and we have a conflict, like, you know, my wash machine overflows, the water goes down. What happens is, well, I tell it to my insurance company, they tell it to their insurance company, they negotiate. We don't shoot, right? And there's no reason for that. So this sort of deterritorialize the problems, I think can create a lot of solutions. I talked about this, just if we facilitate geographical mobility, it will create a lot of advantages of globalization for people who right now don't benefit from globalization. You know, the pensioners, they don't benefit from globalization because they can't go. They're stuck with whatever health insurance where they have. They need the health insurance. They can't go to another country, even if it's cheaper. And then the people from that other country come to their neighborhood and work there, and then they get upset because they don't see the advantage for themselves. And if European states become a bit more like the Knights of Malta, that could be one solution. And it's a solution that has historical precedent. Like, you know, it works. There are other precedents for that, but we don't need to get into that now.
We'll have to finish now. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.